things haven't gone according to plan. The question for the committee is whether the deviation from plan is terminal or whether it is a regrettable but ultimately manageable setback on the way to a mature capability. I think it is much more likely to be the latter than the former, despite much that the committee has been told in written submissions and in evidence here. I won't claim to have enough information at hand to make a solid judgment, though I would hazard that my professional qualifications and experience make me a reasonably experienced judge. My doctorate is in physics. I've been involved in defence capability development for over 20 years, and I managed a technical analysis branch in what was then DSD, which had responsibility for electronic intelligence. As well, I've had good access to the F-35 program during my time at ASPI. I have had briefings from our own Department of Defence, Lockheed Martin, and discussions at the Pentagon on the subject. Most of the discussions were at the unclassified level, but I had the opportunity to discuss the modelling and simulation work that underpins the concept of operations for the F-35 with the practitioners. My conversations with those involved in modelling work suggest that I was dealing with careful analysts who well understood the nature of their business. They could explain their assumptions and, critically, how they tested the sensitivity of their conclusions to variations of those assumptions and of input parameters. The results of that work, which should be available to the committee should you choose to ask for a brief, is starkly at odds with some of the material in submissions you have received. Which brings us to the nub of the question that anyone wanting to understand the F-35 inevitably comes up against. Who is right? On one hand, you have a very active group of critics who have managed to get traction with the media and with elements of governments in Australia and Canada at least. And as their submissions show, the view is that the program is a fiasco of extraordinary magnitude. On the other hand, you have the acquisition organisations and air forces of some of the most professional and competent operators of combat aircraft in the world. I include in that list Australia, Canada, Japan, Israel, Singapore, the United Kingdom and the United States. Those groups have access to classified data on the aircraft, and the partner nations have good internal access to the program. Their collective judgment is that the F-35 is the way ahead for them, way ahead for their air combat capability. I think the Canadian government will return to that conclusion unless money is the only driver. It is true that the American procurement system has the odd hiccup, and it has produced some systems that are far from meeting the cost-benefit balance required to justify their procurement. That generally happens when they shoot for ultra-high performance with insufficient regard for cost. Occasionally, the American system produces systems that don't work as advertised, and the airborne laser comes to mind as one such, but only very occasionally. Much more often it is cost that leads to a death spiral of ever lower numbers and higher unit costs. In that list I'd include the Seawolf nuclear submarine, the B-2 bomber, and ironically, given that it is proposed by many as the solution for alleged intractable problems with the F-35, the F-22 Raptor fighter jet. All are fine platforms and all are unaffordable. They are not good solutions to military problems. In summary, to conclude that the F-35 is not the right solution for Australia's air combat capabilities, we have to assume that the American procurement system has made a rare error on the biggest program it has ever done, and that the most professional militaries of the world have failed to notice that when doing their due diligence. That said, further slippage of the program seems possible, particularly where software is concerned. In our submission, we talked about a hedging strategy of additional Super Hornets in the event that a danger of a capability gap emerges in the next few years. That was certainly the right answer when the Howard government purchased 24 Super Hornets back in 2007 as an interim capability. But that came with a cost of over $6 billion once maintenance for the rest of this decade is taken into account. So it's not something you'd repeat lightly. We believe that that remains the most viable fallback position, and I'm happy to expand on that in our discussion this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Davies. Can I just get you to restate, you mentioned a briefing which might be valuable to the committee. Can you just restate that again?
Yeah, well, yes, I've been working at the unclassified level for almost my entire time studying the F-35. I've had briefings from the project office in our Department of Defence and from Lockheed Martin and from the United States Air Force as well. I think if those briefings could be made available to the committee, it would be very helpful for you to understand exactly where the F-35 sits.
Okay, so that's an offer if we take it up of...
Well, I'm suggesting you approach the Department of Defence.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. So we'll
But there are certainly briefings at an appropriate level.
Okay. Now, you go on to say that in your submission, page 3, that there are a few realistic alternatives to the F-35 at the moment. Other potential choices are less stealthy, have poorer electronic warfare capability, and are likely to be well matched by the F-35. Could you just restate that as evidence? We've heard a lot of evidence this morning to the contrary. What would you like to put on the public record?
Well, I think it's not a terribly controversial position. If you look at the world market, there are many advanced fourth-generation aircraft that were not designed for stealth, don't have anywhere near the level of networking capability that the F-35 has, don't have the electronic warfare capabilities that the F-35 will have, and in short would represent a very poor investment in terms of future-proofing an air force.
Senator Conroy, do you have a question? We've lost him again. Senator Fawcett.
Mr Davies, Dr Davies, can I take you to the procurement program and the methods of procurement? Despite, we are where we are in terms of sunk cost and commitment to moving forward, well, what lessons do you think Australia should be learning out of this in terms of how the JSF has been procured, the concurrency, the approach to actually committing to it before we actually understand its final performance and cost? And do you think anything can be done to make the residual of the acquisition part of the program more effective?
Thank you, Senator. As you say, we are where we are. Our submission suggests that rather than get caught flat-footed should something happen to push the F-35 further into the future, a modest amount of staff work be done in terms of a contingency position that could be activated perhaps 2 or 3 years from now. I think that's all that we can realistically do in terms of remediating the current situation. The 2002 decision to precipitously abandon the careful analysis work that was going on at the time and commit to the Joint Strike Fighter was clearly an error. Clearly, the Australian government at the time signed up to something that was far less mature than they judged it to be, and the management of our air combat capability in the 2000s was predicated on something that was realistically unlikely to happen, and that is a delivery of a $47 million Joint Strike Fighter somewhere in the early 2010s. Okay. And as a result, I think the F-111 fleet in particular was mismanaged in its last few years because a replacement was looming. As I said, the cost of the interim air combat capability, 24 Super Hornets, price tag was $6 billion to the Australian taxpayer. It will be closer to 10 by the time that the F-35 is in squadron service.
We've seen the conspiracy of optimism that essentially describes the 2000 decision in many other projects, and one of the mitigators against that is having certain qualified people to do early test and evaluation. Do you support calls in at least one of the submissions to this inquiry that we should, even at this late stage, be increasing our investment in the test and evaluation program for the Joint Strike Fighter?
That's hard for me to evaluate. If there's something that the F-35 has not lacked, it's been testing. The United States process has thousands of test points. At various stages over the years, I've had briefings where tracking the number of test points versus time and consistently falling behind the planned testing. But I don't think there's been any lack of it. If there's a problem, it would be with Australian visibility of it, but I don't see much evidence for that either.
Mm-hmm. My final question, although the Williams Foundation argued that the Typhoon was a sunk cost for the UK, and that's why they elected to invest in a further 2 squadrons, certainly the US Orbat includes multiple types of aircraft for different roles, and the Joint Strike Fighter is just one. There are other nations that are buying the Joint Strike Fighter, but they are continuing to operate different aircraft types, either for different roles or just to have some degree of asymmetry in the threat they present to a potential opponent. Does ASPI have a view, or do you have a view, on whether Australia should commit to a single aircraft fleet, or would we be well served to continue to invest in having a second type of aircraft?
Well, in practice, we're going to have a second type of aircraft for some time to come anyway, in the form of the Super Hornet and the Growler. There's no doubt that a single type fleet is a compromise. It's a compromise that comes with a lot of benefits in terms of maintenance and the balance of fixed and marginal costs, because every new type comes with its own fixed costs. So that's the calculus that you're trying to do when working out whether to have a mixed or a single fleet. You're trying to work out where that cost-benefit balance is. The F-35, if it performs as advertised, is actually a pretty good all-rounder.
I think we'll conclude there. If it performs as advertised, again, I'd come back to my point about having a sovereign understanding of risk and performance. Yes. Requires our own test and evaluation. But, Chair, thank you.
Thank you. Now, Senator Conroy, are you there? No? Senator Wish-Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. Dr Davies, I did like your term conspiracy of optimism, and I'm interested, do you still think it's a conspiracy of optimism at this stage of the program as well?
I think I wouldn't characterise it quite in that way. I think there's still a little bit of overselling of schedules, and I think in particular software may continue to be a problem, but I don't think it's anywhere near the level of misplaced optimism as was the case before the 2010 major reshuffle of the program. I think the F-35 was being run on a pretty optimistic and pretty poor basis before the 2010-2011 rebaselining.
It interests me that you, in your introduction, that after you talk about conspiracy of optimism, your bottom sentences then said, this is for your first paragraph, yet those close to the program, both here and in the United States, are resolute in their view that the aircraft remains a potential game changer in air warfare. Does it concern you that those close to the program are those who have a vested interest in seeing this program succeed, their reputations, their legacies over decades, plus the sunk costs, and that you're only likely to receive positive information from such vested interests?
To some extent, yes. And when you're talking to the manufacturer in particular, the interests are clearly such that they will support the aircraft come hell or high water. I don't think that's necessarily true of the United States Air Force, because when it's all said and done, they're putting their future capability on the line.
They've certainly been, some of them have been quite outspoken, which surprises me. Some of them have made very public comments about their concerns over the years with the program.
Yes, and some of that is down to Washington Beltway shenanigans, and in particular any concerns that come out in the month before the annual budget negotiations with Congress should be taken with a grain of salt. But look, it would be surprising if there was a $300 billion program that wasn't generating a bit of heat and light. I think that would be disappointing if there weren't pro and con views coming out. I don't think we'll ever see a program of this type again, and I think it's fair to say that it was poorly conceived. The idea of producing a single type for Air Force, Navy and Marines use has driven the complexity of this program far higher than it needed to be if they had been single service projects. I don't think we'll see that again. So I think there are some serious lessons to be taken out of the F-35 experience. So
the word complexity comes up a lot when asking questions about, for an amateur like me, when asking questions about this program. Is it a situation where those who have the classified information essentially have the intellectual property of this and have that vested interest to see this succeed? I mean, obviously we can get some kind of we have had some classified briefings already as a committee, yet the kind of detailed submissions we've received about verification and testing data, it seems though the company the company has that data and other defence interests, but it can't be shared. It's very difficult for us to make an assessment when we can't actually access that data.
Yes, and I totally understand that. That's the circumstance I've been working in for the last 10 years to a large extent. And that's why I said in my opening statement today that I won't claim to have enough information at hand to make a solid judgment.
Well, I suppose what concerns me most is the cost of the program and whether it meets Australia's capabilities and whether we're getting value for money. You did mention in your opening statement it's substantially more expensive than early costing suggested. Yes. Are you aware of the nature of the contract? Is it essentially, I know it's gone through different phases of its development, is it essentially a cost plus arrangement for Lockheed Martin?
Well, the terms have varied within the United States procurement system. It's certainly been on cost plus for a large part of its history. That's not been the case for the last few production batches. To a large extent, we don't care about that. As a partner nation, we're not paying the R&D costs. We pay our annual membership and that's it. So the increase in research and development costs has not been something that's caused us direct pain.
Essentially, we have a free option on the program. Is that?
Yeah. Essentially, we'll pay the spot price for the aircraft in the years in which we acquire them.
So the opportunity cost is then whether it's the right technology and the right weapons platform for Australia's capabilities.
Yes, and when I look around, I don't see any credible alternatives.
Okay.
Dr. Davies, just on that cost issue, there was evidence this morning that it's, I think the Canadian witness said it was 100 and it'll get down to 80. Do you concur with those sorts of the decline in the cost?
Yes, that sounds about right. Back in 2007, I think it was, I wrote a paper on the cost of the Joint Strike Fighter, and I looked at the historical trend. And the result I came to was that in 2020 dollars, it would be about 90 million. So yeah, that's about right. And the F-35 has not defied historical trends. It's coming in right on trend.
And that's American or Australian dollars?
American.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've heard the term acquisition malpractice, and I understand that came from the Pentagon originally, yet it's been quoted by various people in their submissions, and you have alluded to the poor process to begin with. Do you think that's delivered structural flaws in the aircraft? Do you think that there are concerns around the aircraft that are the symptoms of that malpractice?
What was the term?
Acquisition malpractice. I can give you the quote. The direct quote was from Colonel Frank Kendall, Acting Pentagon Head of Procurement.
Right. Okay. Well, as I said, I think there have been structural problems in the F-35 program. Absolutely. I think it's first.
But not in the aircraft.
Well, there have been flaws found in the aircraft at various stages of testing, including some structural problems. There were problems with a structural bulkhead, for example, and some of the aircraft that have been produced to date will at some stage during deep maintenance need those parts replaced. I don't know whether you describe that to acquisition malpractice, whatever that means, or whether it's one of those engineering problems that happens in complex cutting-edge platforms, which would be more my inclination to ascribe.
Given that there still is significant software development bugs that need to be weeded out of the system, and there will be ongoing upgrades over the project life of the plane, are we essentially signing up to a never-ending price tag on a plane like this? How do we actually estimate the operating costs of a plane like this?
Any military platform we buy, we're signing up to a future cost, future upgrade costs, future maintenance costs. My rule of thumb, and I noticed that Mr. Williams from Canada quoted a very similar figure, is that the 20-year through-life cost of the aircraft will be about twice the acquisition cost. And typically, when you buy an aircraft, complexity drives both the acquisition cost and the support cost. and that's why you get that that proportionality between the acquisition cost and the through-life cost. So what we sign up to essentially is 3 times the acquisition cost over the next couple of decades.
Just on that though, I think we took evidence that there were 7 million lines of code in one aircraft and there are 20 in the F-35. Does that mean that we're buying, 3 times the complexity in the through-life costs?
Well, it means we're buying 3 times the complexity in the software, yes.
Is that a risk or is that a...
Well, it's like any complex system that you buy. There's a balance of engineering practice and risk acceptance. 20 million lines of code is a lot of code. And just picking up on a comment that the previous witnesses made, I'm not sure we would want copies of the source code here in Australia being tinkered with to produce a baseline source code that was different from the next version that was going to be released to all of the customers through the United States. I think the model of having people in the United States working with the software reprogrammers is the correct one.
However, I'm a bit of an Apple fan, but I'm not sure it's been good for my wallet.
Well, the market has spoken. People have made their judgment about functionality and cost.
Well, in terms of cost, putting functionality issues aside, I mean, I know they're related because fixing potential problems it comes at a cost. Are you aware of any estimates around the future operating costs and maintenance costs of the F-35 for Australia? And what they might be based on and how we could access them?
It's been a while since I've seen any such figures. The first set of figures I saw going back almost a decade ago were unrealistically low, which is a comment I made in a report that I wrote for the Departments of Defence and Finance. But almost every cost associated with the F-35 program at the time was unrealistically low.
Just a matter of interest, why was that? Why did we get it so wrong?
Well, because every now and then somebody comes along and says, hey, we've got great new ways of doing things. We've now got everything is digitised on the production line and we can manufacture to very high tolerances, etc., 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 and that's going to revolutionise manufacture and make things cheaper. And every time it fails to do so.
Is it also because the threat environment's become more complex?
Well, that's what's driving the complexity of the aircraft and its systems, absolutely. Back in 1917, a Sopwith Camel only had to be able to point and shoot.
Yeah. Those are the days, eh?
Yes.
Yeah. Could I ask you, one of the questions one of the statements you also made in the submission was, the law of high-tech work for Australian industry has distorted government decision-making. That's the first sentence of your paragraph. You go on to talk about the contingent nature of that work. This is similar evidence that we heard from Alan Williams in Canada, yes, that the government essentially signed up to get industry access to work and jobs and that kind of thing. Yes. Could you tell the committee what your experience is there or why you made that comment in relation to Australia?
Why I made that comment is that the industry work has been used both as a carrot and a stick. Governments love the promise of local industry work, and we've had several major procurement decisions in Australia that I think have been distorted by that love of local work. I think that's why we have the MRH-90 helicopter rather than Sikorsky Blackhawks for the Army, for example, because the Eurocopter people promised a helicopter assembly facility in Brisbane. So I think that sort of thing happens all the time. Where it got very unseemly, I thought, is when there was serious disquiet in Australia about the direction of the F-35 program, and I think that disquiet was reasonably based because I think the program, as I've said several times, was very poorly run.
This is under the Gillard government, especially?
I'm just trying to place exactly the time. I'd say around 2011.
Yeah, 11, 12.
Yeah. And Lockheed Martin officials came out and basically wagged their finger at us and said, no, if you pull out of the F-35, that industry work goes away. I don't think that's a good position. I think that's an unfriendly thing for an ally to do.
Okay.
Senator Wilson, we have Senator...
Yeah, well, last question, Chair, and I'll wrap this up because you've got a whole page on a potential capability gap, because in your submission you have raised at least the risk that we may need to fill the capability gap if there are further delays. You said it seems to us that it would be prudent to at least devote some staff work to developing an alternative, and you've said that given a 3+ year lead time for the delivery of new-built Super Hornets, we'd need to make a hard decision by 2019 at the latest.
Yes.
Is that? Can you explain why 2019's the cut-off?
Well, simply because the classic Hornets that still form the lion's share of the Air Force's fast jet fleet start dropping off the twig around 2022.
Yeah.
Senator Xenophon.
Dr Davies, thank you very much for your submission and your evidence. I've asked other witnesses this in terms of ASPI receiving funding from Lockheed Martin or a subsidiary of it. Are they a sponsor of any events or anything like that to any significant degree?
Yes, Lockheed Martin are one of our corporate sponsors, as are Boeing, the manufacturers of the Super Hornet.
Right.
ASPI has been directed by successive governments who own our company to find independent sourcing. And the way we've done that and maintained our independent voice is to get us sourcing from as many of the competitors in the defence space as possible.
Well, I understand. That's
Yes.
not a criticism.
No,
So ASPI, so Lockheed Martin would be one of the most significant contributors to ASPI, or just is it how much of a proportion roughly of revenue would Lockheed Martin make?
Lockheed Martin are one of our top tier sponsors, but Boeing have been at the same level for about the same period of time. So
Okay.
they're a significant...
So it kind of neutralises
Yeah,
that out.
well, yes, that's how we try to work things, and thank you for the opportunity to put that on the public record.
Sure. Just want to ask you, is it a fair summary, and I'm not trying to be glib about this, a fair summary of your submission? The F-35 program is not without its problems. The program is stabilising, although costs could still rise. There are no credible alternatives, but maybe a hedge is required, perhaps more Super Hornets. Have I missed anything?
No, that's it in a nutshell.
Okay, good. Yeah. That's right. So, in your submission, you don't really discuss if it's the right aircraft. In your submission, you discuss a platform-centric Type A versus Type B analysis versus scenario-based planning analysis, where you ask the question, is the solution the most cost-effective way of achieving some objective? The problem I have with that statement is that the Air Force's Air Power Manual suggests that you need to have air control in order to effectively carry out many of the missions that the RAAF needs to. Air control either requires air supremacy or air superiority. Is that a reasonable proposition?
Yes.
Right. Fundamentally, that requires a type of Type A, a squadron of Type A aircraft with supporting systems to beat a Type B aircraft with supporting systems.
Yes.
That's pretty axiomatic. So to achieve air control, don't you need the better capability? In other words, the better aircraft and supporting systems?
Well, yes, but it's the systems that's important, and you also have to put it in the context of the sort of things that our Air Force actually does. The Air Force will always have to have the capability of defeating force projection against Australia. But if you look at the prospect of that happening, A, it's unlikely, and B, it's very, very difficult because we have both the curse and the blessing of having an entire continent to ourselves. And projecting power against that, as we saw in 1942, is actually very hard. So in terms of the sort of reasonable amounts of force you can imagine being projected against Australia, F-35 plus tankers plus Wedgetail actually looks like a pretty credible air defence system. The other thing we do is we go and fight in coalition operations with the United States. And having the same equipment that equips many United States squadrons, and I include the Super Hornet in that as well as the F-35, would be on the same footing as the US Air Force and the US Navy.
Okay.
So it looks like a fair enough solution to me.
Sure. Two more questions, and one of them I think you may want to take on notice. I don't know if you've looked at the Air Power Australia's 01 comparative chart, whether you've had a chance to look at that chart. Yeah, you've got it in front of you.
Yep.
I'm quite happy for you to take this on notice because we've had previous witnesses from the Sir Richard Williams Foundation who basically said it's not a valid comparison. They were quite critical of it and they can provide more details. Can you take on notice and tell me where you say whether it's right or wrong, because it seems they've actually gone to the effort of of trying to do as fair as they can from open source information a comparison of the various aircraft?
I'm reluctant to do so because of the amount of work that would be required to do it.
Okay.
I've seen similar tables to this in the past, and people I've spoken to within both Lockheed Martin's operational research area and at the Pentagon said that they've tried to replicate some of the results that come out of the work of Air Power Australia, and they've struggled to do so.
We might ask Lockheed Martin to provide us their own views and responses.
Yes, they have more resources than I do to respond to this.
Yeah.
Now, I should say that there's two possible explanations for why they can't reproduce it. One would be that they're not as good as Air Power Australia, and the other would be that they're working with a set of data inputs and assumptions that are different.
Okay. Finally, you write in your submission that the government, quote, shouldn't rely on defence for dispassionate advice. Their answer will remain F-35 pretty much independent of the question, close quote. Firstly, I assume you're not looking for a job with the Department of Defence anytime soon?
I gave up that dream years ago.
You gave up that dream, a dream or nightmare. More seriously, can you elaborate on this comment? It's a pretty serious and damning remark.
Yes, well, look, it's based on two things. One is the sociological observation that air forces are very much creatures of technology, and the highest technology aircraft they can get their hands on is always their highest priority. Okay. And I'm not the first one to make that observation. There was a study by a RAND analyst called Carl Bilder, who wrote a book called The Icarus Syndrome, in which he talked exactly about that, how Air Force is always seduced by high technology.
Didn't end up well for Icarus, did it?
Yeah.
No.
It's also the theme of Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff. So yeah, there's a cultural element to it. But the other thing that made me make that comment is a former Defence Minister said to me that it became clear after many discussions with Air Force that F-35 was the only answer there was.
Okay.
Senator Conroy, are you there? Senator Wish-Wilson, one last question.
No, I'm good.
Oh. Senator Wish-Wilson, one last question before we move on.
I just wanted to ask Dr. Davies, is just going back to my first question about relying on information from those close to the project and various governments supporting it for industry policy reasons, as well as to build a new weapons platform. Is this project too big to fail?
No, I think it could fail. I think there's no such thing as a project that's too big to fail, but I don't think there's a lot of evidence that it's going to fail catastrophically. It certainly failed to deliver according to schedule and original cost projections. Failure in that sense. There's no doubt the United States would be in a real hole in terms of its air power. The United States Air Force in particular would be in a real hole if the F-35 program fell over. So to that extent there will be impetus for it to keep going regardless. But having said that, I can't see them managing their future capability into the ground, which is what the premise of your question would require them to do.
I'm not saying they're doing it deliberately.
Yeah.
I'm just interested. It seems there's so much momentum behind this now to make it work. There are some who are saying it's structurally flawed and won't meet its objectives that were set out to be achieved in the early 2000s,
well,
late 90s.
I just remember something Hugh White wrote around 2008. He said the F-35 will be late, it will cost more than we thought, and it will never deliver all of the capability promised, but it will still be the best option. And I think that's probably where we are today.
It's because we haven't invested in another option, so I think that's fairly logical.
Well, I don't think there are any other options.
We are over time, and that was a particularly prescient note to finish your contribution, Dr. Davis. Thank you very much for your appearance here today. If you've taken questions on those, you have an appropriate amount of time to respond.
Thank you.
We now welcome